The storm raged outside, lashing against the ancient house as though it had a vendetta against it. Each crack of lightning illuminated the peeling walls and dusty corners of a place abandoned long ago. But tonight, it wasn't empty. A group of 5 friends, Chris, Layla, Ryan, MIA, and Daniel, had dared each other to spend the night in the rumored haunted house that had been the bane of the town's history for over a century. Inside, the air was thick, heavy, as though it resisted every breath they took. Each step they made on the creaking floor seemed to echo louder than it should, amplifying their unease. They joked on the way over, laughing and brushing off their fear as childish. But now, each of them could feel an unmistakable tension pulling at their nerves, like something in the darkness was aware of them, watching. "Guys," Layla whispered, breaking the silence as they reached the grand hall. "Look at this." Her flashlight beam landed on an imposing door at the far end of the hall. Unlike the rest of the house, which was deteriorating into decay, this door was untouched by time, made of dark, gleaming wood and bound in iron with symbols they couldn't decipher. It seemed to pulse with a sinister energy of its own. Around the frame, ancient carvings writhed like shadows in the light, resembling twisted faces and elongated hands reaching out from within the wood. "That's not creepy at all," Ryan muttered, trying to laugh but failing. "Dare you to open it," Chris said, nudging Ryan. Ryan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fine, let's get this over with." As he approached, the rest of them stayed rooted in place, unease building. He reached out, and just as his hand grazed the cold metal handle, the entire house seemed to shudder. A gust of wind, bitter and rancid, swept through the room, snuffing out every flashlight but one. Layla's weak beam flickered, casting eerie shadows over Ryan's face as he turned, wide-eyed. The door creaked open on its own, with a slow, painful groan, as though reluctant to reveal what lay behind it. Beyond the threshold was not another dusty room or decrepit hallway. Instead, it was a dark, yawning void, from which an overpowering scent of rot and sulfur flooded out, filling their lungs with its repulsive, suffocating stench. The darkness inside the door seemed alive, pulsing like a heartbeat, inviting them in while threatening to consume them whole. "Let's leave," MIA whispered, her voice barely audible over the ominous hum coming from within the room. But it was too late. Something had crossed from the other side, something that was now lingering in the room with them. A low, growling whisper, like gravel being dragged across bone, echoed from the depths of the door. Its words were incomprehensible but laced with venom, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply, their breath forming in wisps before their faces. Daniel, the bravest of the group, tried to laugh it off and took a step forward. "Just a trick, a prank or something. There's no such thing as a real haunted." He froze mid-sentence, his eyes widening in terror. The others watched, paralyzed, as a dark stain began to spread across the front of his shirt, blooming like a grotesque flower. It was blood, his blood, seeping from a wound that hadn't been there moments before. "Danny." Layla's voice was a thin, horrified whisper. The stain grew, faster now, and Daniel clutched at his chest, gasping, choking, as the blood flowed freely, dripping to the floor in a steady, unnatural stream. His knees buckled, and he crumpled to the ground, eyes vacant, lips moving in silent horror as though he'd seen something none of them could see. Before they could react, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them with whatever had crossed over. The room fell into a crushing silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of the remaining 4. Layla clutched her flashlight, so tightly her knuckles went white, and Chris backed away until he hit the far wall. His eyes locked on Daniel's lifeless form sprawled on the ground. The blood pooled beneath him, thick and dark, seeping into the ancient floorboards, as if the house itself was drinking it up. What just happened?" MIA's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with horror. Ryan, who was closest to Daniel's body, shook his head, stammering, I don't know. I didn't see anything. There was nothing there." Just as they started to gather themselves, a new sound filled the air, a slow, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragged against stone, coming from somewhere beneath them. It was a deep, echoing noise, as if someone, or something, was moving in the walls, pressing and clawing closer with each passing second. Layla's flashlight flickered as the sound grew louder, filling the space with a chilling, resonant hum. She pointed the beam down and gasped. The pool of blood around Daniel had started to shift, moving in unnatural patterns, twisting and swirling in shapes that defied logic. Circles, symbols, shapes that none of them recognized but instinctively feared. The blood seemed to be alive, slithering along the floor and tracing patterns like a sinister script. Chris was the first to notice. What is it doing? None of them dared to answer. The patterns grew sharper, more intricate, forming symbols that felt wrong, like forbidden words none of them dared speak aloud. And then, as if summoned by the very markings on the ground, a whisper rose from the floor, a chilling, malevolent voice that echoed through their bones. The voice was low and deep, like gravel scraping against iron, and each word made the hair on their arms rise. "You have come." MIA grabbed Chris's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now." She tried to move, but her legs felt rooted to the ground, as if the house itself wouldn't let them go. Ryan, desperate and panicked, stumbled toward the door they'd come through, frantically pulling at the handle. But it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door was part of the wall now, the seams invisible, trapping them in the darkened room with whatever ancient horror lay beyond the symbols. "Please, let us out," Ryan shouted, pounding on the wood, his fists raw and bloody. A soft, wet sound began to echo from behind them. It was like footsteps squelching through thick mud, coming from the far corner of the room. One by one, they turned to face it, terror rooting them to the spot as the darkness in the corner twisted and shifted, taking form. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, emaciated thing with skin stretched tight over bones, its face hollow and featureless except for two black pits where eyes should have been. The creature's limbs were long, too long, ending in fingers that seemed more like claws, tipped with jagged, bloody nails that scraped along the floor. The creature moved slowly, its head tilting as if listening to their terrified breathing. It opened its mouth, a cavernous, unnatural void, from which a swarm of insects began to crawl, spilling onto the floor and dispersing in every direction. The stench of rot filled the air, overwhelming and nauseating. Ryan tried to back away, stumbling as the figure advanced on him, its hollow eyes seeming to pierce right through him. With a strangled scream, he collapsed, crawling backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to escape the creature's gaze. But it was relentless, and as it stretched its bony hand out, a coldness washed over him, sinking into his very soul. "No, please, no." The creature's fingers wrapped around Ryan's throat, lifting him effortlessly, its nails digging into his skin. His eyes bulged, his hands clawing at the skeletal hand that held him in a vice grip. His friends screamed, powerless as they watched Ryan's body twist and contort in agony, his skin turning pale as though the life was being drained from him. As Ryan's last breath left his lips, the creature tossed his body aside, discarded like a rag doll, before turning its hollow gaze on the remaining three. "Who next?" The creature's gaze roamed the room, its hollow eyes seeming to drink in the fear that filled the air. Layla, Chris, and MIA huddled together, clutching each other in desperation. They'd lost Daniel and Ryan in minutes, their bodies lying limp on the floor, eyes wide open in expressions of eternal horror. But there was no escape. The door had sealed shut, and the walls, once cracked and decaying, now seemed thick, pulsing with the same eerie energy as the door that had led them here. MIA whispered, more to herself than to the others, "This can't be real. It can't be. It's just a nightmare." But the creature moved again, its fingers tapping a slow, deadly rhythm against the floor as it advanced, its head tilting as though savoring their fear. Chris, shaking but determined, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. He held it up, his hands trembling. "Stay back," he stammered. "I swear, I'll..." But before he could finish, the creature's arm shot forward, its hand closing around the knife with impossible speed. It crushed the blade in its grip, metal screeching as it bent and twisted like paper. Then, With a force that defied nature, it flung Chris across the room. He hit the wall hard, slumping to the ground, dazed and bleeding. The creature let out a guttural sound, almost like a laugh, though it was more a scraping, hollow noise than anything human. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a moment. When they came back, MIA and Layla saw that Chris was gone. Not a trace of him remained. No blood, nobody, just a deep, dark stain spreading where he had landed. MIA and Layla were alone. "Layla, what do we do?" MIA whimpered, clutching her friend's arm. Layla shook her head, her face pale, her mind racing. But the symbols on the floor caught her eye. She could feel something strange, like a magnetic pull from the markings that seemed to writhe and pulse, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. It was as though they were alive, inscribed in blood and darkness, calling to her. In a moment of frenzied inspiration, she grabbed MIA's hand and whispered, "The symbols, maybe they're a way out. Maybe we can use them against it." MIA hesitated but saw no other option. Together, they knelt on the ground, running their fingers over the twisted shapes and markings, following them like instructions from an ancient, forbidden language. The creature watched them, its empty eyes narrowing as it realized what they were trying to do. It lunged forward, faster than anything they'd ever seen, reaching out with its long, skeletal hands. But as it neared the blood symbols, the creature recoiled, hissing in pain, its flesh smoldering as though the symbols burned it on contact. It let out a hideous shriek, a sound that tore through their minds, but it couldn't move any closer. "Keep going," Layla shouted, feeling a surge of hope as she traced the symbols with her fingertips, chanting words that came to her as if from a place buried deep within her mind. The room began to shake, the walls trembling, and cracks appeared on the floor. The creature writhed, its body twisting and contorting as though trying to escape. But it was trapped, held in place by the symbols they had activated. The darkness pulsed and expanded, drawing everything toward the center of the room, as though the very fabric of reality was collapsing inward. Suddenly, the door they'd come through groaned and burst open, spilling a cold, grey light into the room. Layla and MIA looked at each other, understanding flashing between them. It was their only chance. "Run!" Layla screamed, pulling MIA to her feet. They bolted for the door, racing through the darkness as the creature thrashed behind them, letting out a final, soul-piercing wail. The house trembled, walls cracking, floors buckling as though the entire structure was being swallowed by the dark void. They didn't look back, didn't stop running, fueled only by sheer terror and the desperate hope of escape. They burst out of the house and into the night, stumbling into the cold, biting wind. The storm had cleared, and the silence that filled the air was heavy, oppressive. Turning around, they saw the house, and nothing else. The building was gone. All that remained was a dark, empty lot, as if the house had never been there, erased from existence, leaving behind only a charred, blackened patch of earth. They stood there, panting, their minds reeling, struggling to make sense of the horrors they had just escaped. The house, the creature, the symbols, none of it seemed real. Yet the blood on their clothes and the terror in their hearts proved otherwise. "Do you think they are still?" MIA whispered, unable to finish the sentence. Layla didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she took MIA's hand, and together they stumbled away from the lot, from the town, vowing to leave this nightmare behind forever. But as they disappeared into the night, neither noticed the faint red glow that still pulsed on the ground behind them. The same twisted symbols, etched into the earth, waiting for the next unlucky soul who dared to disturb the ground where the house once stood. The ground that was now the gateway to something dark, something ancient, something that was still watching.